Hi, I'm back with another fascinating ADO.NET video where again we're going to be focusing on the data set, which provides the client with cached records from the server where the client can access the data, manipulate the data while in a disconnected state, and then when they're ready to synchronize to the server, connect again and allow the changes to propagate. So I want to look inside of the table that we're going to be using, and I'm doing this from SQL Server Management Studio. And as you look at data in the employee table, you'll notice that record 25 relates to an employee named Humphrey, and record number 26 relates to an employee named Bentley. And I'll be deleting both of these records as I demonstrate the program. So I'm going to flip back over to Visual Studio, and I'll be using Form 8, which has the navigation controls to move forward and backward through the cached record set, through the data set. It has a control that allows me to delete the record from within the data set, not the table immediately, but within the data set. And then I have a control that will allow me to reconnect to the database to allow the changes to occur so that it will synchronize the data set and the data table. And then also I have these controls where I can see the rows in my data set row by row. Okay, so let me run the program. Let's see how this thing works. So start out from the user's perspective. You get the starting menu, and I'm going to choose this control to get to Form 8 where I'm able to delete from a data set. And I'm going to advance the row pointer till I get to one of the records that I want to delete, and I'll delete it from the data set. And then I will continue to advance and delete the next record from the data set. And I'm going to go back to previous records. Now I've got a few little glitches in my data controls here, in the controls that allow me to navigate back and forth, but I'm not terribly concerned about that right now. When I give you a copy of this program code, you'll see what I mean. Sometimes I have to strike the button twice to get it to advance. Okay, but it looks like everything is dialing through the records okay to me. Okay, with the exception of these navigational controls not working 100% correctly. I'm going to then actually, return back to the database, connect to the database again, and propagate the changes. So I'll click on this button, and when I do, it connects to the database, synchronizes the database table, the employee table, with the data set on the client, and then the program will row by row look at every row in the data set, looking at its row state properties, and any row state property that says delete, then that record will be deleted from the database. So I'm going to flip back over here to Management Studio. Now these records still appear to be in the database, but if I in the database table, but if I close this table and open it up again, you'll see that they're gone. So just, one of those quirky features in SQL Server where it requires me to refresh the display. So at this point, records related to Bentley and Humphrey are gone from the table. And let's go back to the program, and I'm going to stop this thing from running, and then we're going to look at get back to this. Okay, we're going to look at the program code behind the Form 8. Now, I should tell you that there's going to be a tremendous amount of similarity between the program that I demonstrated yesterday and the program that I'll demonstrate now. Both use a data set. And so if we look at the code behind the code page here, we're going to see that, again, I'm using classes from the .NET class library at the namespace system.data.sql client, and that I'm creating two persistent class level objects, one to represent my data set, the other one to represent the corresponding data table. I also have a integer variable called row count that I'm using, to keep track of the current row that I'm accessing in the data set. And so this value needs to persist, and that's the reason why it's a class level variable. So when the program starts up, the first method to kick into gear is going to be the form load event, where it's going to call up a private method I've written called build dataset. And if we look at build dataset, it is pretty much the same code that you saw yesterday. If you compare the side by side, I think it's identical. But we create a data adapter, which will allow us to configure the SQL and the connection, and then will allow us to execute the SQL and fill the result set from the server. And I mentioned yesterday that this actually does this under the hood using a data reader, but when I work with a data adapter, I don't have to create a separate object and manipulate the data reader directly. That's all done indirectly or under the hood for me. So we've got the data adapter serving same purpose as we saw yesterday. I've got a connection object, and I'm again using local variables to represent these things, because once this method concludes, these objects are not of any value to me, so I want them disposed of immediately. And so I instantiate the data set class in this line of code. Remember that obj dataset is a class level variable, so I declared the variable but stopped short of instantiating the class, and now I'm instantiating the class using that class level variable. So from this point on, my dataset object exists. I create a table object, and I have not associated it with this dataset yet, but that comes here in a moment. I open the connection and then wire up the data adapter. So I create my instance of the data adapter, obj adapter, and in doing so I pass two arguments to the constructor, an SQL string that represents the SQL that I want executed in order to fill my data set on the client, and then the name of the connection. So I just use my connection object, which has been configured previously. Excuse me. So once the data adapter has been created, the next step is to execute a fill method, which will associate the data set and the source table on the server. And at that point, my data set will be populated with the result set. This is where the data reader is invoked, and it returns all the records that are necessary to fill the data set. Then the data table object that I created but did not associate with any particular table object within my data set is now associated with the one and only occurrence of a table in my data set. And what I mentioned yesterday was that data sets can be created so that they contain multiple tables and relationships. And so there could be instances where if I had, say, 2 tables, I would have the ability to reference obj dot tables 0 being the first table in my data set, first data table created in my data set, and assign it to an object name. And I could create another separate object name and assign to it obj dataset.tables sub 1. But in this case, again, I only have one table that I'm working with, and so now obj data table is going to have all the data. It's more or less a mirror image on my client of the employee table. And I reset row count equal to 0 because there will come a time when, after propagating the changed data set back to the data source, I'll want to throw away the old data set, throw away the old data set table, and rebuild everything. And at that point, I'll set my row count so that it then is prepared with a new data set to access the first row. Okay, so that should be review from yesterday. And once that data set is populated, the user still doesn't see it. So again, after the form load event calls build data set, it's going to call another private method that I've written called display row. And in display row, I take the columns, initially the columns from the first row of the data set, and assign them to individual controls on the form. So if you're following this, I reference my data table object. It has a rows property, and that rows property is subscripted using 2 indices. The first one being a value that represents the row that I want to access, and the second one being an index that references the column within that row that I want to access. And again, these have a 0, start out with 0 displacement. So when I reference row 0 as row count would be equal to 0, and when I reference column 0, then I'm really looking at the first column on the first row of the data set. And so I assign all the columns of the first row to the data set to corresponding controls on the form, and then the form load event is done, and that's where the user sees this. Okay, and I'll stop that. So when the user has access to the form, what would they do? Well, they could click on the navigation buttons, and I'm not going to go into any of that detail in this lecture because I went through it yesterday. And basically what I'm doing is just bumping up or bumping down row count and having to do some decisions as to whether I need to make an adjustment if I've gone past my first record or gone past my last record. And I have a button here now that says delete dataset. Actually, there's one less thing I have to do on the form with this example, because I'm not inserting any new rows, so I don't have to clear out the text boxes in preparation for inserting a new row. I'm just going to communicate about the current row that's being displayed. And so when we look at delete from dataset, let's take a look at what's going on there. This is how it changes the row state properties in the client's cached data set. And how it does that is it uses a delete method on the table rows property, and it points to the specific row. And at this point, really all it's doing is just changing that row state property, just marking that row as having been deleted. And when it does that, I'm having to make some adjustments to my row count, and I think I need to clean that up just a little bit, and then display the next row. Okay, so that way when I get this thing, all the navigational controls tweaked properly, I should be able to delete a record and up pops the next record. Okay, so this is dealing with changing the state of the data set, and then I have the method here to actually write back to the database. So let's take a look at delete record, which is a method that I have written here that's going to contain some ADO.NET code. And I've wrapped things up in try catch, and what I'll attempt to do here is to create a string. So I've got a string variable SQL delete that is a delete command, okay, and it references a command parameter. Okay, so we talked about this yesterday, that's really just a placeholder, and in the end, whenever I invoke the update method on my data adapter, then the data adapter will start with the first row and go through every row there is, and where it finds a row state value of delete, it's going to take that employee ID value and plug it into the parameter and pass that back to be executed on the server. So the other thing I should point out here, and I meant to mention this yesterday but did not, I'm preceding these strings with an @ sign. Now in this case I don't think that's going to be necessary, but the reason why you're seeing that is that if there are slashes or backslashes, those can be interpreted within the string as an escape character, as an ASCII escape character, and not have the SQL, and not to communicate the SQL meaning. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm just being super cautious and saying use the literal translation of this for the SQL command, and don't interpret any special characters in here as being ASCII escape characters. So that just sort of safeguards this thing from being misunderstood as the statements being translated in .NET. I have a connection object that I wire up because I'm getting ready to propagate back to the database, and I wire up a command object here, create a command object, wire it up with the SQL string, and with the connection object as the second argument being passed to the constructor. So we've seen that done numerous times now. And open the connection, and I create a command parameter, and again I will be equating a .NET parameter name with a particular field in the employee table, and I'll be mapping this using the correct translation of .NET data type to SQL Server data type. And once that command parameter is created, I create a new instance of a data adapter and assign to the delete command instead of the insert command the command object. Okay, so everything that command object has been configured with in terms of properties and methods is provided to the data adapter, and then the data adapter pulls the trigger by executing an update method, and this is where it's going to go row by row through the data set, looking at that row state property value, and where it says delete, then that's going to be communicated to the database management system, which will then delete those rows from the employee table on the server. And once that is done, this method is finished, control passes back. Where I want to clean out the old data table and the old data set and rebuild things with a fresh copy of everything that's in the employee table. So I'm going to end up disposing of the data table and the data set objects. Those are class level variables that otherwise would persist, so I get rid of them with the dispose ADO method, same method that we looked at yesterday, and then I call up the same two methods that were called up in form load to set the data set up and set the form up with to display the first row from the data set. Same thing that I did in form load, I repeat again after I have propagated back to the database server. Okay, so that is pretty much the story on this one, and I will upload this video to YouTube and then provide a link to that URL through this linked label control on the form, and that way as you're looking at the program code, if you need to see this video a time or two, then you have a convenient way to get to that link. Thanks.